Alrighty, thank you guys for sticking around with us. For the next panel, I'll be joined by Representatives Adam Schiff and Representative Mac Thornberry, and we're going to have a discussion on whether or not the Pentagon is ready for the cyber battlefield. So first of all, I just want to kind of get the take from each of you as to what the status is from you, Congressman Thornberry, of work on legislation that would help the Pentagon best impact cyber actors, and from you, Representative Schiff, on the kind of the tensions between finding that national security mission and privacy concern. So Representative Thornberry, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's still a work in progress. And if I step back and start with the Constitution, where it's not only Congress's responsibility to declare war, but regulate the land and naval forces, raise armies and navies, and so forth. And so if you think about how you fit that constitutional framework into a domain that moves at the speed of light, where attribution is sometimes challenging, putting all those pieces together is difficult. So on armed services, we've been trying to ask this question: what do we expect the military to do to defend us in cyberspace? Now, some of that may be legislation. A lot of it, I think, is the arrangements or the process. For example, last year, we included in the Defense Authorization Bill a quarterly requirement for the military to come, or Cyber Command actually, to come and brief us quarterly on major cyber operations as a way of exercising the oversight that we have to exercise. And so I think with cyber in particular, it is these process issues that is a lot of working our way through how we can defend the country in that domain that is unlike any other.
And what are you seeing so far from those quarterly reports?
A lot of the same things that one sees in the newspaper. A lot of activity, of course, coming from China and other countries we know. But there are some things happening in cyberspace that don't make the newspapers. And so part of what we're trying to do is keep a track on the threats, but also on our capability to deal with the threats. And are we standing up the kind of capability, including the people, the technology that we need? But to me, the biggest gap is not the people or the technology, it's the laws and policies that enable us to engage in this domain. I think that's the biggest gap that remains, and so that's a lot of what we're trying to close through hearings, through these process arrangements, and legislation when needed.
Congressman, you talk about some of the tension. You hear a lot about these threats, but obviously, as the debate over at the NSA has shown, there's a very big, real concern among the American public when it comes to civil liberties and privacy and making sure that those things are protected.
Well, absolutely, and we have an enormous challenge on our hands that's been made more difficult, more complicated by the Snowden disclosures. On the front end, I think it's quite apparent to all the members of Congress that we have a major challenge on our hands in terms of the potential cyber attack, the ongoing cyber espionage that is attacking not only our infrastructure, potentially our Defense Department, but also civilian private contractors stealing billions of dollars worth of intellectual property. So the threat, I think, is recognized very much across the board in Congress. The response to it started out in the form, at least from the Intelligence Committee perspective, with legislation like CISPA, and there were a number of issues that we were not able to resolve when the bill was initially taken up. I think there are predominantly four areas that we were wrestling with. I think we made significant progress on two or three of them, but the issues involved what's the scope of the information that we would gather to try to share so that the government agencies that have access to some of the signatures of those cyber threats can share them with industry. Industry that's been attacked can share it with other industry and can share it with the government. So what's the scope of the information that should be gathered? What's the purpose for which that evidence or that information can be used? In other words, if you gather material, is it solely confined to use to protect infrastructure, protect trade secrets, or if you discover other criminal or other activity, what use can be made of it? And then there were issues as to what the lead agency should be. Should it be a civilian agency like DHS, or should it be an agency like NSA that may be far more efficient, but since we're talking about private data, there was a level of discomfort with the idea of the NSA as opposed to a civilian agency like DHS being the primary point of intake. And then the final issue, which made the least progress on, it was the issue of minimization. And that is, to what degree should the private sector remove personally identifiable information before sharing it with the government? And on that final issue where we made the least progress, I think the debate will be significantly impacted by the Snowden disclosures. I think the degree to which the public may be willing to have the prospect of more personal information shared with NSA or the IC is probably a lot less than it was in the pre-Snowden disclosure world. So those issues still remain on the table. There is, of course, the other complete category of issues involving infrastructure and the degree to which the government will either on a voluntary basis or a mandatory basis ask industry responsible for that critical infrastructure to meet certain standards. So those are the remaining issues, I think, on just the CISPA piece that we have to resolve. But you're right, there are not only a broad recognition of the problem and this massive transfer of wealth, even quite apart from the risk that's posed to our defense, our weapons systems, our national secrets, but also some considerable hurdles in the approach we take to meet those challenges.
Congressman Thornberry, can you talk a little bit about how this is operating in the post-Snowden era as it relates specifically to defense, to DoD's responsibilities, the things you all talk about on the House Armed Services Committee?
Well, we're not in the post-Snowden era yet because he dribbles out a leak here and there out of context with obviously a clear agenda. And it does color our ability to move forward, I think, on some of these issues. I'm really fairly optimistic that the House has passed the information sharing bill twice. It looks like the Senate has kind of narrowed its focus. It's not going to insist on some giant, 2,000-page bill to solve all the problems in cyber. It's going to narrow its focus. And so I'm fairly optimistic that the issues that Adam laid out can be resolved, and we could do a information sharing bill, which, as your previous panel was just talking about, would be very helpful. But because of the Snowden leaks and some of the other things, politically it's hard to move forward at this moment. Hopefully we can move forward before there is some sort of devastating attack. I mean, it's serious enough that we have this constant stealing of information, including vital defense information. It's worrisome enough that some countries are using cyberspace to advance their agenda, even some of the folks that are not the most sophisticated actors. But clearly the potential for a devastating sort of attack is there, and we need to act before that. I think there's all sorts of interesting questions raised by some of the issues involved in the information sharing bill as well as some of the NSA things. For example, where is your personal data safer? In the hands of a private entity or in the hands of the government? And so there's lots of issues that are raised. I guess my thought is we don't have to solve everything at once, but we can take some steps in the right direction, and information sharing would be a key step, even though it doesn't solve and doesn't purport to solve all of the challenges that we face in cyberspace.
One of the big questions that we were talking about as we were thinking about the idea of the Pentagon's cyber battlefield is, of course, the budgetary issues. The military has been hit by sequestration. Now, obviously, the furloughs, of course, there's an announcement this weekend by the Defense Secretary. How bad is this budget impacting this environment? I'd like to get the answer from both of you on that.
It makes a significant difference. I mean, our thought in passing on September 29th and 30th the Pay Our Military Act was that essentially all military would be paid and everyone who supports the military would be paid. Now, it took the Pentagon lawyers about a week to understand what that meant. But finally this weekend they said, okay, most of these civilians, not all, but most of these civilians can go back. But still, the upheaval, I think, is a detriment to the country. And I know this is painful, but what I personally hope is that when we get through this, we can have some stability in defense and intelligence budgets. Because if you think about it, if you're competing with Google and Apple for the top quality people in cyber, this living from CR to CR, the threat of sequestration, all that goes with that, makes it a difficult working environment to recruit people because you're not going to beat them on salary. It's going to be something else. And so some stability in defense and intelligence budgets, I hope comes out of this, and I think it will be very important to building the kind of capability we need.
Well, I would just add, from the intelligence community perspective, obviously this has been a very destructive exercise, and while in the Defense Intelligence Agency arena and the DoD side of our intelligence funding, there are going to be a lot of employees called back to work. Still on the civilian side, there are going to be a lot of folks who remain away from their posts, and obviously our adversaries who are looking to attack us either on a cyber basis or on a physical basis aren't being furloughed. So it's a real setback, and as Mac points out, it's just one of a kind of continuing set of economic body blows to that workforce, to have stagnant wages, to have now furloughs, and you can imagine the intelligence community already has some serious morale issues given the context we've been reading about it in the papers for quite a long time now, or it seems like a long time. So it's very destructive. I do wonder whether we need as massive a furlough as we're seeing in the intelligence community, where I understand 70% of the workforce is being furloughed. That seems to be a pretty strict reading of the furlough requirements, considering the very direct nexus between protecting the national security and those jobs. But nonetheless, they have very good attorneys within the IC who I'm sure are being conservative in their judgment, and so it's had a real impact on our ability to do the job. I'm sure that within the IC they're prioritizing, and so some of the analysts that are working on less immediate targets from a cyber and other point of view are probably those that would be furloughed first. But I will make one other point, because this will extend beyond the furlough and the immediate budget problem, and that is we're obviously going to be in a budget-constrained environment for a long time. And one of the most significant new expenditures in the last decade has been on cyber within the intelligence community, and that will probably continue. There has been no other area where I've been as concerned with the prospect that we could be investing a vast sum of money in systems that have the potential of being outdated the minute they go online, because cyber changes so quickly. So from a budgetary oversight point of view, this is a really key area to make sure that what we invest now is not only going to be a good investment tomorrow, but won't be quickly overcome by what our adversaries are doing in the cyber arena. And it may be that cyber turns out to be the asymmetric battlefield of all asymmetric battlefields, in the sense that while yes, having the top cyber capability from an offensive point of view is a great advantage, nonetheless, a small investment in a cyber by our adversaries may be sufficient to overcome a mass expenditure on cyber defense by ourselves. And this is a challenge we're going to have in this budget-constrained environment.
Do you share that concern?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Clearly, the United States has more to protect than anybody else. So the danger of asymmetric value in what some country can do to harm us is definitely there. I mean, I think where our resources and capability ought to go is primarily in people. I guess my concern is is not so much we're going to spend money wastefully on technology and people right now. My concern is more that our laws and policies won't keep up with the adversaries' changing tactics and evolving threat that we face. And that kind of goes back to what I was mentioning at the beginning. We have to figure out how something that moves this quickly, that poses a danger to this many sectors of our economy, can be dealt with in a constitutional legal framework that we're all comfortable with. Again, post Snowden when we get there. So I think that is a big challenge, and that is a lot of appropriate questions for us to ask on intelligence and also for us to ask on the military side.
I just want to remind you all that the hashtag for the event is Cyber7, and to let you know, if you were standing in the back, feel free to bring your cup of coffee and hang out with us in the front. There are a couple of open seats. I don't think anybody wants to stand all morning, so feel free to come up here and hang out. So you mentioned people repeatedly, and both of you have, and looking at our cyber workforce. The last panel, I don't know how much that you heard, was talking about recruitment and retention. And we had folks who are in the private sector talking about what impetus is there for them to stay in the government, to stay in the NSA, to stay in the IC on that side, rather than to go to the public sector, or the private sector, where there are increased salaries and more opportunity. So my question to both of you all is, how do you keep them here instead of seeing them go to those offshoot companies?
One answer, I think, is greater flexibility. And the bottom line is you'll never outpay the private sector. What gets and keeps people is they get to do cool stuff in the government. But on the armed services side, one of the things we keep asking is, do we have the flexibility to get and keep the kind of people we want? And are the career tracks for military folks sufficiently flexible that it fits this new kind of specialty that may not fit exactly in a traditional military sort of specialty? So I do think for us in congressional oversight, in both intelligence and the military, that asking these questions about pay and incentives, but also career tracks, and whether we have the right sort of arrangements for people who want to serve their country in this way, that we make it possible for them to do that. I think that is part of our job, to keep asking, and certainly we're trying to do that.
We had a commission up here before the committee recently, and one of the issues that they had looked into was the IC's ability to recruit and attract and retain top talent, particularly in the technological area. Yahoo's and the Microsofts and Apples. And they've made a number of interesting observations. We've obviously accelerated our efforts at recruiting at college campuses. But when you look at how many campuses the IC does interviews on and how many actually join the agency, it's a very small number. And one of the points that they were making is, young people, they're very idealistic. They want to be able to serve the country. They want to be able to take on challenges, do things that they can't do anywhere else. And the government and the IC provides those opportunities. But we have to make that clear to young people that are graduating college or graduating from graduate school, that they'll have the opportunity to work on some of the most path-breaking science and technologies, that they can do that in the service of the country. And because those that are attracted to the intelligence community, to public service generally, the paramount concern is not the paycheck. If it was, they'd go somewhere else. But it's not always clear, I think, when we do our recruiting, that we have these attributes to offer. That recruiting is, I think, going to be a lot more challenging right now. If you're a young person and you've been reading the newspaper, or probably more likely reading online, you may not be thinking about joining the NSA right now, given the beating the NSA has been taking. But the NSA needs great, bright, idealistic people. And the NSA has some of the most talented, brilliant people. And we need to keep that pipeline going. So we have our set of challenges. But I think because we can only do so much on the pay side, being able to appeal to the opportunity to serve and the opportunity to do science and engineering and be on the cutting edge of technology could be very attractive.
I want to ask about specific global threats. If you're looking at places like China, like Iran, like Syria, for both of you, are we doing enough right now to counter those threats that seem to be ever present?
Are we doing enough? No, is the clear answer. And I think I break it into two buckets. One is, are we doing enough to make it harder for them to attack us by hardening our own systems, by improving our cyber protection here at home? And that gets back to the information sharing and the other sorts of ideas and proposals that have been floating around that have not quite made their way to the president's desk. I hope, as I said, that gets rectified. I mean, the other side of it is, are we doing enough from a military standpoint, not only defensively but offensively? And there, I think it is the area where we are the people and the technology is far outpacing the laws and the policies. So that's where we're really playing a lot of catch up, and we hadn't caught up yet. So, and we have to work our way through these issues. As Adam was talking about privacy and some of the other things, how do these unique challenges of cyberspace fit in our legal policy framework with the different values that are at stake? And the United States is on the cutting edge of these things. So if we start to do something, say, offensively, does that set a precedent for what other countries can do? And we have to think through those issues. So that's why I think the policy and the legal stuff is lagging, and we have a lot more catch up to do to be in a position where we really can do everything we could do to defend the country.
I'd probably break it down in two or three ways. Are we doing enough on protecting critical infrastructure? Are we doing enough on protecting our DoD agencies and secrets? And are we doing enough to prevent the theft of IP and the body blow on our economy? And I would say in terms of protecting DoD and our core national security interests, we're never doing enough, but we are making a vigorous effort, which is proportionate to the resources that we can devote to the task. So, I think we are doing what is necessary, although we always need to do more. In terms of protecting critical infrastructure, I don't think we've done nearly enough. And in the category of protecting ourselves from the massive transfer of wealth by the theft of our intellectual capital, we're not really doing anything of significance. And that is an ongoing, persistent, and overwhelming injury we're suffering right now. I think we have devoted our resources where they're most necessary, but we have a lot more to do. The primary and most capable actors are in Russia and China. But we see increasing sophistication in Iran, and we see, probably more than nuisance capabilities in places like Syria, and that is only going to accelerate. We can't allow it to be a circumstance where it takes a really serious cyber attack on our infrastructure to get us motivated.
There was an interesting question that came up on Twitter earlier. A person asked, should the American government be tackling cyber threats through offensive or defensive means? So I'd be curious to get both of your takes on that.
Yes. One never wins a competition strictly by reacting to what the other side is doing. So you will always lose if you're always on the defensive. But that's why I think it is so critical. If we were to take and these words kind of get a little muddled about what offensive defensive is, but generally, if we were to take some sort of offensive action kinetically, then generally the president will consult with Congress and so forth before it happens, depending on the circumstances. I think it is really important that the administration consult with Congress on the rules of engagement for offensive action in cyberspace. Again, this stuff is happening at the speed of light. You're not going to be able to come and consult. It's unreasonable to expect them to as it's happening. So you need to kind of have the rules of the game laid out ahead of time, not down to finite detail, but at least in a general way. And so that's part of the reason I keep coming back to these policy and legal issues, because the more you have them sorted out ahead of time, the smoother things will go when the electrons start flying.
Well, I would say I agree. We need both the offensive and the defensive capability. Clearly, we need the defensive capability. In terms of the offensive capability, and if worse ever came to worse, you need to have the offensive capability. And cyber is a key component of the new kind of warfare that we're in. Even apart from any kind of doomsday scenario, if you have a limited military operation, the ability to go in and compromise the systems of your adversary is a key component of warfare. So we need that offensive capability. Also, developing the offensive capability teaches us a little bit about what other capabilities might be used against us. The real challenging thing, I think, as Mac alluded to, are those situations that are a little bit of both. Let's say that we have a cyber attack that comes in and is stealing our material or damaging our computer systems or infrastructure, and we can see the home address of where this is coming from. It's a grave temptation to say, why don't we just follow that electronic trail back and blow up the machine that sent it to us? Some of these people who are attacking us are state actors. Some are quasi-state actors. They're like private hacker bounty hunters. And if you can go in and quite easily destroy their infrastructure, you make them pay a price for the attacks on us. But there's never 100% certainty on those things, that the electronic missile you send back to blow up their system doesn't go awry and end up attacking someone else's system. So those are very difficult calls and a complete kind of another world of cyber. And I think Mac is right. We need to try to develop some international protocol in this dangerous new world we're in about what kind of a cyber response is appropriate when cyber attacked.
We're just about out of time, but I want to get you guys very quickly to respond to, on HASC, on Intel, what should we and our viewers be watching for next with regards to cybersecurity in those committees?
Oh, the elephant in the room is budget stability, I think. So that's the key. That's the key for people. That's the key to be able to plan ahead on any endeavor. And so if I have one priority at this stage, it is to have some budget stability, and then we can continue to work on these policy and legal issues.
Well, I never thought we would shut down, and then once we did, I never thought it would go beyond a week. So I'm batting 0 for 2 in my predictions, so I would take any projections I give you with a big grain of salt. But I think it's very unlikely that we make much progress on cyber legislation, on significant cyber legislation this calendar year. I think a lot will depend on the report, the framework the administration comes out with in, I think, February next year, what their recommendations are in terms of protecting critical infrastructure. And we'll continue trying to work through those cyber issues I mentioned at the outset, House and Senate, to see if we can pre-agree or pre-conference or come to some meeting of the minds on it. But given the crowded nature of the docket right now and the competition with all the FISA court and other metadata reforms that are percolating, it's hard for me to see cyber information sharing legislation breaking through that during this calendar year, and I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see much legislatively until the administration comes out with its framework in February.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. For our next conversation, I'll turn it back over to Tony, who will be joined by Chairman Mike McCall. I'll be interested to hear what his forecast is for the legislation moving forward. Thank you all so much.